Hello and welcome back. So in this video, Nelson will be implementing his test rig. Nelson?
All right, so the goal of the test rig, like we saw last time, was to essentially record expected actions that the parser is going to take and then actually match those actions against what was recorded. If those actions are not what was recorded, then the test rig should throw an exception, and that should be logged as a failed test. So what I'm first going to do is I'm going to go into my iTestRig interface, and I'm going to add another method to it. So we have the expect method. That's going to be used to by our builder classes to say, okay, we expect this action, we expect that action, we expect that action. And then we're going to have the parser, as it executes itself and as it invokes the methods on the style sheet builder interfaces, we're going to want it to invoke another method based off whatever methods were called against the builders. So that method is going to be called match. So if you think about it, expect's about queuing up actions, match is about dequeuing actions and ensuring that they are the actions that you expected.
Okay.
So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create the style sheet builder, an implementation of the style sheet builder interface, and that's going to invoke the match method as the parser invokes the methods on that interface itself. So I'm going to start with a style sheet builder, and our style sheet builder is going to implement iStyle sheet builder, implement all its members of one member, and then he's going to accept in his constructor an iTestRig interface. And then on the create rule, he's going to return a new rule builder passing in the rig. And I'm going to go ahead and create the rule builder. So I'm just adding another class called rule builder who accepts an iTestRig interface, sets it to a local variable, and then implements the iRuleBuilder interface. And so I'm going to leave set property alone for now because I want to just stub out the next class that we need, the selector builder class. So this is basically going to do what it did before. I'm going to say return new selector builder, passing in our rig. Now I'm going to go ahead and create that class. The class is going to implement iSelectorBuilder, implement all of his members, and then create a constructor call with the iTestRig parameter. Okay, so that was fairly standard stuff. Now we can go ahead and actually start invoking the match methods. Or actually, I'm going to, now that you see that all the actual builders are implemented, I'm going to start with the expect methods. So the expect methods are going to be invoked by our configuration object. So for example, you see the rig.rule method gets this configuration object R right here. So when r.selector is invoked and s.class is invoked, I want a new action to be expected. So I'm going to start off with the rule configuration. When a selector is invoked, I'm going to go ahead, or I can even start further with the parser test rig. When a rule is expected, it's going to go ahead and invoke config with a new rule configuration passing in the test rig. So it's basically just executing this delegate and then wrapping it with an invocation to the rule configuration constructor. Also, because I added a member to the iTestRig interface, I'm going to go ahead and implement that. But match will be done later. First, we're dealing with expect. So the implementation of expect is going to be very simple. It's going to be private read. We're going to add a private read-only queue of type iAction. Then we're going to go ahead and instantiate it, and we're going to do that to get rid of the squigglies that were erroneous. The expect method is just going to say expected actions.enqueue action, and the match is going to say var. It's going to say if expected actions.count is smaller than 1, throw a new invalid operation exception, saying that the action could not be matched, and then pass an action. And then we're going to say to match is expected actions dequeue, and then I'm going to say if action, or rather action to match dot should be, or yeah, should be action. And then so this will just go ahead and use the equals method that's available in the action. If you remember the iAction interface, it only implements or inherits from the iEquitable interface, which just provides an equals method. So yeah, as far as actually running the test rig, it's pretty straightforward. All we have to do is instantiate our parser, pass in our CGS lexer, pass in the input to our CGS lexer, and then pass in a style sheet builder, which is going to be our custom test rig style sheet builder. Then I'm going to say parser.parse, and at this point, expected action should be 0 because we should have matched all the actions that happened. So we'll do expected actions.count should be 0. So that's it for the test rig, really. Now it's just a matter of implementing our style sheet builder class of interfaces with the match method and the configuration classes with the expect method. And then I'm going to dump this over to an explicit implementation as well, so that whoever instantiates the parser test rig actually can't even see these methods, well, by default. So let's go ahead and go back into our rule configuration. So when a selector happens, we're basically just going to do the same thing. We'll say config, and then we're going to pass in a new selector configuration, passing in our test rig. And when this happens, so now we're going to go ahead and configure that. In the constructor of our rule configuration, we want to say we want to expect an action, a rule entered action. That means we're starting a whole new rule. And if I didn't match an action when the rule configuration is instantiated, then if I was testing the difference between two different rules, they could overlap without having some sort of delineator. So I'll start that by showing a basic implementation of a basic action that really doesn't do much. And that's going to be, I'm going to add a namespace called actions, and I'm going to create a class called rule entered action. He's going to implement iAction, which forces him to implement the equals method. And then I'm just going to say return other is rule entered action. Because there's no parameters to compare, we're just making sure that the action that we're matching against is a rule entered action. Finally, I'm going to go ahead and implement or override the toString method so that we get some nice debugging output. So now that we have that action implemented, we can go ahead and say rig.expect new rule entered action. And this, like I said, basically says now when the parser is invoked and actually you invoke the parse method on it, we want to make sure that what happens next is a rule entered action if we configured it like that. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with our selector configuration. I'm going to create a rule called selector entered action. Implement the iAction interface, return other is selector entered action, and implement the public override toString method, and just return out selector entered. So now that we're in our configuration, our selector configuration, we can expect a new selector entered action. So now things get a little bit more interesting. This should be capital ID, by the way. They get a little bit more interesting because we now have to expect rules that have particular parameters. So the first thing I'm going to do is our class selector. I'm going to say class selector action implements iAction. Now he's interesting because a class selector, actually we want to match against whatever class was typed in to the parser, and we want to make sure that it's the same thing that we're expecting. So this guy needs a parameter, which I'm just going to call class. Pull him into a local variable. Then I'm going to say var action equals other as class selector action. If action is false, if action is false, I'm going to say return action does not equal null and action dot class equals class. So there you go, class selector action. So now we can match it by just doing rig expect new class selector action class. Same thing with ID. Or rather, I'm going to go ahead and be sure to implement the formatting operators for all of these different actions, because that will help in the actual debugging a lot. So I'm going to say class selector, and then inside parentheses, I'm going to stick the class that was expected. So I'm going to go ahead and add the ID selector action. He's going to implement iAction. And he's pretty much going to be our class selector action. So I'm just going to yank all this code, dump it in here, change this, and then change this, and then change this class to ID, and tell it I want to change that. So there you go. It's very, very similar. While we're here, might as well throw in the element selector action as well. Should be still on my, no, it's not on my clipboard. So yank some code, paste it in, implement an interface, make this a constructor, change this cast, rename this to element, and then fix our formatting selector. So now if we jump back into our selector configuration, our ID will expect a new ID selector action, given whatever is given, and our element will expect a new element selector action, given the element. And so now we need the immediate descendant, any descendant in pseudo. So I'll say immediate descendant action implements iAction. This is going to be a simple one. Other is immediate descendant. There are no parameters that you need for this particular action. Public override to string. If you're wondering why I don't generalize these actions, I really want to keep things as absolutely straightforward as possible when writing tests. Even writing this much logic in a test isn't, something I always want to do. In this case, it's, worth it because we're testing against a very complex system. And if we were not to actually have this infrastructure in place, we would end up with a lot of nasty mocks and a lot of nasty random interface implementations for our builder interfaces that are complicated and have to be redone every time. But when I actually get to writing the test rig, I want to keep it as simple as possible. Also, so that we don't end up debugging our test code, which is always a waste of time. So then we'll write an any descendant action, which straightforward. Other is any descendant, and then public override to string return any descendant, and then rig expect new any descendant, and then finally our pseudo, which is going to be just like an ID, for example. So I'm just going to steal this action. Bring in the action and change this to pseudo, or is that it? Maybe. I don't know. I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Wait. Oh, no. No, it's PSEU.
Okay, there we go. And then change this, of course. And then change that and that. So that should leave our selector configuration complete. So that should be everything but, as far as our configuration, everything but our properties. Our properties are a little bit more complicated because we're going to have to match these values and the name. So we'll call this a property action. It'll be of type iAction. It'll take in a string name and an IEnumerable of iValues. And then it'll also bring that into a local variable. And then I'll just say var action equals other as property action. And then return action does not equal null. And action dot name equals other action dot our name equals action dot underscore name. And then for the values,
hang on, hey Nelson, hang on 1 second. We seem to have a bit of a Skype glitch going on for a second. Are you there?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead and continue. I think it's faded out now.
Okay.
Nope, I was just kidding. It has not faded out yet. Are you still with us?
Yes.
All right, well, let's try one more time.
Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that whatever was trying to be checked for equality with us is a property action, and that their name is our name. And we also want to do something else. We want to make sure that all of the values that were passed in match all the values that we expected. And I'm not going to care about order right now. I'm just going to do a really quick little trick that you can do called, or using a basic link trick, I guess you could say, with except other or action dot values any. So not accept other collection any. And of course, this will go through and invoke the equals method on each one of our values, which gives us our own custom equality comparison code that we wrote earlier in the video before this. So now that our property action is created, we can go ahead and say rig expect new property action, pass in the name and pass in the values. So that's our configuration. Basically what will happen is at the end of configuration, so by the time we get down to this run method, we will have a queue inside of our rig of every single action to expect from the parser. So the next step is we know that we have these style sheet builders, selector builders, and rule builders that are going to be used inside of the parser to invoke methods on. So now we just have to do the inverse of what we were doing before. I'll start with the style sheet builder, and the create rule does instantiate a new rule builder and passes in the rig. But what I want to do in the rule builder is the opposite of the rule configuration. I want to match a new rule entered action. For the create selector, I want to return a new selector builder passing in my test rig. And then inside of my constructor, I want to say match new selector entered action. And then I'll just do, like I said, just do the inverse. So rig match new class selector action class. Rig match new ID, selector ID, and then, you know, we can just really just copy and paste this. Very repetitive, but straightforward. And that's a good thing when you're working with test code. Element selector action element, immediate descendant, no parameters. Any descendant, no parameters. Pseudo selector with a pseudo parameter. Now let's hop back over into our rule builder, and we have the set property method, which will just go ahead and say rig.match new property action, passing in the name and the values. So as the parser goes through and actually invokes methods on our builders, we will match each individual action to what the parser is supposed to do. So let's take one more quick look at our parser test rig, make sure everything here is like it should be. When we create a rule, we just invoke that delegate. When we run, we create our new parser, passing in our custom style sheet builder. And then we invoke the parse method on our parser, and we make sure that it's eaten all of the actions that we queued up. When we queue up an action, we just enqueue our data structure. When we match an action, we make sure that we don't have an empty collection. We dequeue the action that we're going to match, and we make sure that they're equivalent. So this will actually result in expected actions being one item less every time match is invoked successfully. So that's about it as far as the test rig goes. You'll see it in action once we actually start implementing our parser.
Right.
And we certainly have enough tests in place to get pretty far in our parser and to watch everything come together nicely.
Yeah, and for those of you that got a bit lost while following through this video, don't worry about it. I think the implementation coming up in the next video is going to be helpful. Plus, I'll make sure to have Nelson do a full review after we get all of that in place so that we can trace some stuff through. So with that, that is going to wrap up this video, unless there's anything else you wanted to add in, Nelson?
No.
Okay, fantastic. And we will catch you guys back in the next video where we will begin implementation. Thanks a lot.